Well, what's crack? Welcome back for another video. Today we have something different in store. We have our special guest with us, Chris Lowe. Chris is a nutritionist, sports nutritionist, has a big background with team sport athletes, some of the best rugby players in the world, and a big background in cycling and endurance sports as well. Personally, I've worked with Chris on and off the last 4 or 5 years, a couple of times, and having different goals throughout that. Most recently working with him through the hamstring recovery process after surgery, which has been class. So we're in the thick of it at the minute. That's my brief introduction to Chris. But Chris, if you want to give a quick background about yourself, and then we can roll into it.
First of all, thanks so much for having me on board today. Cannot wait to get into a few meaty questions that I know is going to provide a lot of value. So thanks so much for that. A little background to myself. As you mentioned, I work with like a wide variety of sports. So previously I would have been just going into teams consulting. So work with rugby league teams like Hull KR, rugby union teams like Wasp Rugby. Spent a bit of time down with Reading Football. So kind of done the team sport to quite a decent kind of standard. And now kind of transition more so online, and I work with a wide variety of athletes from still team sport athletes, but combat sport athletes, endurance sport athletes, ranging like sub-elite to elite level. So that's primarily my main area of focus now, just all online coaching and supporting awesome guys like yourself.
Nice one, man. Nice one. And on that background of the sort of players and athletes that you work with, like obviously you've coached a good few GAA players as well. For me, this is more interesting to know, like with GAA being an amateur sport, is there anything that you've noticed in terms of similarities between the amateur players and maybe like the pro athletes that you've worked with, or any big differences between the two?
To be honest, not really. Like the standard in GAA is really quite high from what I've experienced. So the guys and girls that I've worked with on a one-to-one basis, they're incredibly driven, the standards are very high, and they just want to improve. And from experience, more so sometimes than the professional athletes I've worked with. So I don't know whether it's just a small cohort of like GAA athletes I work with that are incredibly driven, incredibly determined. I'm not entirely sure if that is the standard across the board, but from my experience, the standard has been pretty incredible. Literally anything and everything they can do to improve, to be better, stronger, faster, more skillful, they're going to do it.
Nice one. I think it's the players that are willing to, I suppose, invest in something and put time and energy into something are the ones that they're obviously looking for every tool to improve. So yeah, I suppose it's nice that you've seen that side of players. I've definitely seen another side of players that don't want to do anything, but they can still do the business on the pitch. But no, it's good that you're. I feel proud or something whenever the GAA players are getting a good bit of recognition for something, so that's nice.
For sure. Like I think it's always going to be the case. Sorry, when someone like joins an online program, invests in them, they're going to be a little bit more driven and a little bit more growth minded, shall we say, to really improve and stretch and see how far they can develop. Where if you're going into a team, I say like of say, I don't know, 45, 46 players, like you're going to get a large bulk of them really wanting to improve, really wanting to train well. Some are like high flyers, they don't need that much kind of input, but then you're always going to have that kind of 10% that perhaps aren't going to like engage as well as you want them to, and they leave a lot of untapped potential on the table.
100%, big time, and you see that within team settings all the time. In terms of the chat today, I was thinking about how I was going to kick it off and the best way to help players around nutrition, and I thought the best way to start would be to chat about how players could completely mess up and do the wrong thing that's definitely going to hold them back. So I suppose the first question is, what are the biggest mistakes or negative things that you see players or athletes doing that holds them back from a nutrition standpoint, and how they get in their own way?
I think this is one commonality across the board with every single athlete is fueling properly. So just carbohydrate provision and availability. Carbohydrates for some reason still have this bad kind of name of like they're going to cause body fat gain, and people still kind of fear them, even though I'll try and like push the message of like carbohydrates in appropriate amounts are absolutely amazing. There's still some kind of fear and this kind of resistance to buy into this kind of idea properly. So I think that would be the main thing the main nutrient and the main kind of issue that really kind of holds a lot of athletes back, especially athletes who compete like at medium to high intensities, which are primarily most athletes. We need those carbohydrates to drive performance. So carbohydrates are going to be determined by your training or competition intensity and duration. So the more you train in terms of the duration and the harder it is, the more carbohydrates we need on board. And I don't think many athletes, especially like GAA players, really appreciate how much carbohydrate they need to get through the amount of work they're doing. And this isn't just to support your physical performance, but it's going to affect your mental performance, your health, your quality of life. The list kind of goes on with regards to carbohydrate intake and all like these beneficial KPIs we can look to improve.
100%, big time. And I've seen in my own case, in my own teams, the players that still perform to a pretty high level, and that they're not paying any real attention to their nutrition, and you're just thinking like, how good could they actually be, and how like they'd literally be an absolute freak athlete if they could pay even like 10-15% more attention to their nutrition, looking at the carb intake and having even more energy than they already have. I think they have that like doggedness in them that they just go, but if they're actually fueling properly, it would be insane to see what levels they could actually get to, which is mad to think.
For sure. And I think athletes like that, they'll just have potentially quite inconsistent and patchy performances. Some sessions they'd be like amazing, they're turning heads, they're doing all this incredible stuff, and they're like, wow, what's happening here? And that just might be like an off day that they just fuel right. Then the next kind of week, they can't back up that performance because they haven't got the consistency with their nutrition. And they're like, it's just not his day, not her day today. Whereas like, well, it probably could be if they had the right processes going into that match, not just from like the nutrition side, but the mental side and all the other kind of components that support both physical and mental performance.
100%. That I suppose that's the idea of the tank not running empty, which I'm sure we'll get to later on in the chat here. So following on from that, then in terms of carbs, you were chatting about players not understanding how much carbs they probably actually need to fuel throughout a training week, and then especially for a game as well. If you were to give a step-by-step approach to players in terms of working out probably calories first and foremost, and then looking at like the macro breakdown in terms of carbs, protein, that's obviously the big one. Obviously fats are going to come in there too, but I think for players, and a lot of the questions that I get asked, it's how much protein should I be eating, how much carbs should I be eating. What would be the first couple of steps from getting calories, getting macros in place, and then running with that for players?
So the most important thing is, or the fundamental principle of performance-based eating, is to meet the body's demands. So whatever you burn each day, we need to eat 100% of those calories back to support optimal performance. So we know that no two training days are going to be the same. So you might have like a low kind of chill day, then you could have just like a gym medium day, you could have like a double day, which is gym and like a pit session, you have your game days. So you have these different energy demands each day. So this is basically a periodized approach, right? And therefore we need to make sure our nutrition is aligned with that. If there's a mismatch on these days, this is where you might be in a surplus some days and potentially gaining body fat, or you could be in a large deficit some days, and that's going to affect fueling. So you're going to be underfueling and underperforming. So when it comes to working out your calories, it isn't going to be like one number across the week, because if you have that linear approach, there's going to be big mismatches. So we just need to make sure that we have perhaps maybe like a set number of calorie targets to hit each day, so it's aligned with that demand. Now, how do we find this out? So you've probably gone online and typed in like, how many calories do I need, or calorie calculators and things. Now, these are good as a starting point. Now, when we look at these formulas, so for reference, I'll use the House Benedict formula for getting your basal metabolic rate or your resting metabolic rate. But when it comes to looking at formulas, we need to appreciate that they're predictive formulas. They point us in the right direction. They may still be 10, 15, 20% plus or minus. So say for example, I perhaps have a higher energy expenditure than what's perhaps predicted by a formula, where some people I work with, they have lower. So it's really important before you kind of go into the kind of steps is, whatever number we have is just a starting point to move from going there. So it's a case of you find the number, you adhere to it, and then how do you feel, how do you respond, and then you can adapt accordingly. So when I sometimes do start an athlete off like a brand new athlete, I'll go through the same kind of process and have these kind of initial start numbers. But then if we look at his numbers or her numbers like 3, 4, 5 months down the line, they're so far off compared to where we started with. And like, how do you get to that number? It's like, well, we had an initial starting point and then we just adapted and refined. And we found this point where, we're hitting all our kind of targets. Our body composition is in a great place. Our performance is in a great place. We feel good. Our energy is good. Fatigue management's great. And that's where we kind of settle. So how do we get the starting numbers? So I mentioned about rest and metabolic rate. So this is the amount of calories you need per day at complete rest to maintain normal physiological functioning. So if I kind of just sit in my office chair here, not move a single inch all day, that's basically what my rest and metabolic rate is. So this is basically down to your age, height, age, height, weight, and gender. So males and females will typically have two different formulas there. And like I said, I'll use the Harris-Benedict because it's perhaps more specific to the athletic population. So that's kind of step one, just get your rest and metabolic rate. Then we need to factor in how active you are outside of training. So this is known as PAL or physical activity level. Now this could range anywhere between like say 1.2, 1.3 or up to 2, 2.5. It's quite a big range. And this is sometimes where people don't quite get this one right because it could be hundreds and hundreds of calories out. So as a reference point, I'm somewhat active outside of training. I'll kind of move around, do a few steps, maybe like 6,000, which is probably a little on the lower side, but I'll do some movement. So I might give myself a physical activity level of like 1.5. If you were, had like a job in construction, you're on a building site, that might be going up towards 2.2 or something like that. So whatever that physical activity level is, and you can search these online, you just basically times that by your rest and metabolic rate. Now this is your baseline numbers. This is your rest day, okay? So this amount you need per day to maintain your body weight with no actual structured training. Then we need to add on how much calories you burn in these training sessions. And this is where it can be pretty difficult to determine. So we've got devices like smartwatches, Garmin's, got our Whoops, this kind of stuff. Again, is going to point us in the right direction, but it's not going to be an absolute. So what I'll typically do then is, if you do, 500 calories in a session, I would add those 500 calories onto that baseline. Where the next day, if you do 1,000 calories, you would add that 1,000 calories on top of the baseline. And this is where you have that periodized approach to your nutrition programming. So you'd always have like your baseline, which is your rest day. That's just like a constant throughout the course of the week. Then whatever you burn through training or competition, you will just add that on. And that is mainly going to be carbohydrate driven. So the only nutrient we'll change then is carbohydrates. More training you do, more competition you have, more carbohydrates you need. And then likewise, the less carbohydrates. So all we're doing is adjusting carbohydrate intake on a daily basis so it's aligned with your fueling demands, and therefore you can meet the body's demands better.
Love that, mate. Perfect. You make it sound so simple. In terms of adjusting those calories, you mentioned tracking the numbers, tracking the data, seeing how performance is and all the rest of it, which is brilliant. Say there's going to be a lot of players who have body composition goals on top of that in terms of building muscle or dropping body fat. If we start with fat loss first, like how would you, ideally, when is the best time to go after a fat loss phase in terms of the season? And then I suppose we'll start with that one first. How would you tweak those goals in terms of fat loss, those calories and targets that you'd worked out?
For sure. So what we need to appreciate is that whenever you are in a calorie deficit, so we're consuming fewer calories than we expend. So that's fat loss 101. Okay, we need that mismatch between intake and expenditure. So when you're in a calorie deficit, there's going to be a compromise in your performance, your recovery, your energy levels, your adaptation to some degree, okay? The bigger the calorie deficit, the bigger the compromise. So we need to think, when do we want to be performing at our best? So definitely like going into championship and stuff. So that will not be the appropriate time to drop body fat. So we can almost like get the calendar, the annual kind of calendar, put big red crosses in there. We don't want to drop body fat during that period. We can drop body fat in season between matches for sure. But we definitely don't want to be looking at running a calorie deficit and dropping body fat on match day -1 and match day, because that's going to massively impair performance. So your fueling and therefore performance. So then when's the best time? So it's kind of like right at the start of the season, the pre-season, potentially the off-season as well. So this is where your performance goals aren't as high as they are further down in the year. And if there is going to be a small compromise or small kind of level trade-off, it's better to kind of just manage it there and then. And then when you get into the season itself, you can push your calories up to maintenance just to ensure that your energy levels, fatigue, your recovery, your fueling is absolutely spot on. Because whenever we drop calories, and we have to do that to drop body fat, there is going to be a compromise to some extent. So it's really important that when you're looking at this pre-season period or the off-season period, you just kind of maximize it. You don't just kind of dawdle and like, I'll kind of just get on it a little bit later. And then all of a sudden you go into season, then championship, and you're like, oh shit, I really need to make an improvement here. And then they're like, oh, and how do I drop body fat? And it's like, well, we could have covered this like 9 months ago. So there's definitely time and a place. And the best time would be off season and pre-season. Second to that, you can definitely do some body fat. You can definitely drop body fat in season. So, but this is going to be largely dependent on your playing schedule. If you've got like two games a week and maybe one session, like one pitch session, probably not the best time. But if you have like a couple weeks break, or if it's like every weekend, you perhaps got maybe a 4-day kind of fat loss window in there. But then if you go into the really important times of the season, like it's just not the right time to do it at all. Like you can, but you're going to have a compromise there.
Makes sense. And I suppose the players, that's a case of weighing up the priorities and understanding the trade-offs at different times of the year. I think that's the big thing that you've taught me, was understanding the trade-offs, understanding what the consequences are of a certain action, and being okay with that. So if you're okay with, right, okay, we can drop a bit of body fat, yes, you'll maybe get lean, but your performance could go to shit. Is that worth the trade-off of carrying a small bit more body fat but being at your best come game day and actually having a good performance? What's gonna, I suppose, what's gonna play in your mind more, carrying that small bit of body fat or not performing at the biggest time of the year? And I think that a lot of players will that's a pretty easy question to answer for them, I would say. But I think the big lesson is getting it done at the time of the year where it doesn't directly impact your games or the important stage of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just helps from like a mindset and planning perspective as well. Like if you're in the season, like, right, I've got one objective, let's just fuel, let's recover, instead of trying to balance this like process of eating enough to perform but then restricted enough to drop body fat. It's, it can definitely be done, but you have to be very like strategic in terms of how you approach it. Where if you just end up getting a little bit wrong in kind of pre-season or off-season, where you just end up like overly restricted on one day and you have a bit of a shitty session, it's like, okay, just like subpar session, it's cool. I'll learn from that and I'll adjust for the next time. Where if you have that kind of subpar session, like when like the coach, the manager is really looking at team selection and stuff, it's probably not the right time, is it? So you're kind of thinking like, right, what's the consequences of not performing at my best when I need to? So yes, you have like poor performance, but what is like the further consequence to that? Not getting selected and all this stuff.
I suppose the other flip side of that is building muscle then. And to me, building muscle in season, building muscle at any time of the year seems to be like the nicer of the two. Like you're not as restricted, you're getting plenty of food in. Obviously there's the caveat of if you get too much in, the body fat starts coming with that, and then you leave yourself with more work to do in the long term if you don't get it right. The other side of it is, from a training standpoint, I think you're always going to be well fueled, providing that you're doing the right type of training. I think when it comes to building muscle, from my experience, it's players can go after too much gym work and leave themselves fried, and regardless of how much calories or carbs they're getting in, you just can't beat fatigue by eating more food, and that's where the body fat sort of comes on. So I suppose, again, with building muscle, what are your recommendations around it? How can we do it in season while maximizing performance? And I suppose, are there any sort of key considerations or key sort of thought processes around that to make life easier for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. And similarly, with the fat loss side of things, it's the right time and the place. So we know that the most important driver for muscle growth is your weight training stimulus. Like there's no way around that. You just have to get into the gym and lift some heavy weight, right? And if you're doing that kind of in season, you're probably going to create a lot of muscle damage, accrue a lot of fatigue, and you're going to feel like you've got heavy legs and kind of drained going into the match, which obviously you just don't want. Nutrition has a ceiling, so nutrition can alleviate a lot of that fatigue. It can drive adaptation, it can do all this amazing stuff, but if you're just doing too much, then you're just doing too much. So then it kind of comes back to the kind of off-season, pre-season period. It's like, right, it's okay if you carry a little bit of fatigue going into pitch sessions, because you might be a little bit subpar, but you know you're improving body composition, and that is then going to tie into the bigger goal going into the season itself. So again, it really comes down to looking at your whole year and just kind of saying like, right, I got this 12-week kind of block, I can build muscle, and then performance is going to take a higher priority kind of going into like springtime, summertime, so I'm just going to maintain there. And then going into the off season, kind of back end of the year, November, December, push on my muscle growth there. So that's an absolute kind of key thing. Just really looking at your annual planner and decide when you're going to do each kind of phase, and just kind of go all in with it. Don't just kind of like half-ass your gym work, half-ass your nutrition, and then you kind of get into that kind of February, March kind of time, like, oh, I haven't really made that much kind of progress. And then you get put in the panic, and then you start panicking a bit, and then you try to play catch up, and you can't force fat loss without compromise. You can't force muscle growth without getting a lot of body fat, and you just end up in a pretty terrible position, or shall we say a suboptimal kind of position. So it really just comes down to being as proactive as possible. So for muscle growth, from the nutrition side of things, your energy intake and your protein intake are going to be super important. So I guess if you kind of break muscle growth into kind of three areas, it's going to be one, your weight training stimulus. That is the most important thing. Then enough energy available, because building muscle is just an energy expensive process, to make sure you have a small calorie surplus, and then adequate protein each day. So I think a lot of us are going to be guilty, especially the guys, of like dirty bulking a bit and putting in a lot of body fat, where is the case that yes, we perhaps need an energy surplus to maximally build muscle, but once you satisfy that calorie demand, if you've got a huge amount of excess, you're going to put a lot of body fat on, and then you're going to have to spend months further down the line pulling that back off. Where if you're more sensible with your energy surplus and just gaining a tiny amount of body fat each week just to ensure that you are in that surplus, then it's just going to improve the overall kind of efficiency of the muscle building program. Okay, because if you don't gain like that 5 kilos of body fat, which may take 10 weeks to pull off, you can be in a muscle building phase for another 10 weeks, so you can build muscle for much longer. So just overall kind of efficiency. So yes, you need an energy surplus, but it's a small energy surplus. It's a few hundred calories. It's not 1,000 calories and going into KFC and everything and getting loads of high calorie foods. Okay, and you know, seen it time again. I've done it several times. Didn't learn initially as I was growing up, and it just doesn't work. So most important thing is identify the right time of the year that you can get a lot of time in the gym, and then ensure you're in a small energy surplus, and then ensure you're consuming enough protein, and then it's just time. Just repeat.
100%. Love that. And I think the big thing from anything around performance, dropping body fat, gaining muscle, it's the main thing coming through for me is zooming out and look at the big picture, rather than trying to get everything done in the short period of time and then be in a rush to get the next thing or be in a rush to get to the end point. It's that idea of like accumulation over a period of time. Like, you're going through different phases of the season, and yes, there's going to be times where you can push muscle growth. There's going to be times where you have to pull back on it and other priorities take over. It's not a case of trying to gain maybe like 10 kilo in a year. It's a case of like chipping away bit by bit. Then the next season comes around, okay, we build again. And that's probably mainly for the players who, like the younger players who are coming up to senior, and I get a load of questions, how can I build muscle and get ready for senior? It's like, don't be expecting to go from 70 to 80 kilo in an off season. Like, expect to go, right, okay, maybe we can go 70 to 74, maybe 75, chip away bit by bit, maybe get to maybe 76, 77 by the end of the season, and then continue building the game bit by bit. So yeah, I think you said it, looking at the different stages of the season, understanding the plan, and short term, day to day, being impatient with the action steps, but long term, patient with the overall outcomes. Like you're not going to go massively up the levels in a year. It's going to take a bit of accumulation over time.
100%. Like you can't force athletic development. It takes time.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the issues potentially as you're going into like seniors, and you're going to see like pretty much fully grown men that had probably like 15 years of development on you. It's like, oh, I need to be the same size as them, the same strength.
Yeah.
It's like they've got like 15, almost like 2 decades worth of gym time over you. You don't have to do everything in this next 12 weeks. It's like just be patient with it, and you'll get there.
That's the hardest message. I can remember myself in that stage where I was looking at other players being like, right, why am I not at that level? And it's literally that, like, players have been training 10 years like longer than you. Like you can't expect to do it like that. And like that accumulation effect, whenever after a couple of years, especially with conditioning, I noticed when you look back at your conditioning levels, or when you look back at a session that you did and you found it tough, and then you do that session a year or two down the line, you're like, piece of piss. Like everything just compounds and builds over time. And that's, I suppose you don't learn that with time. You don't learn that until you go through the time to actually give it a chance to work. From your experience then, so we were chatting about different stages of the season. Do you, aside from personal individual goals in terms of maybe we're dropping body fat here or building muscle here, just as a general statement, do you see any big differences in nutrition needs or demands at different stages of the year as we go through the likes of off-season or pre-season into the competitive playing season then?
It's more, I guess, going to be aligned with the goal, the outcome. So like as we discussed, like over off-season, pre-season, it's very much just going to be a case of just physical development. So looking at the muscle, the strength, the body fat. So your nutrition requirements are going to be aligned with that. Then as you go into the season, it's just going to be focusing on that more towards maintenance and just fully focusing on performance. They'd be the main things. So we're still going to be meeting the body's demands. So whatever you burn each day, we're eating 100% of those calories back. The only caveat with that would be with, say, match day -1, carbohydrate loading, where we're going to need a surplus of carbohydrates on board to like super compensate the glycogen stores, and therefore you can perform to a much better standard the next day. So it's the same principle throughout the course of the year. We're just adjusting the finer details that's going to be specific to the outcome you want to achieve. I know some may kind of break this down into like game day -1, game day +1, and game day +1. They might put even more calories in there again just to support any form of healing. That might be an option if you're really kind of struggling with recovery, but it's largely just going to be whatever you burn, eat 100% of those calories back, with the caveat that match day -1, you're going to carb load. And if you are playing 2 matches a week, then you might have 2 carb loads per week, and it's just a good week of eating.
It's a great week of eating, but the body fairly feels it afterwards. That, I suppose that leads us nicely into, well, firstly, the big takeaway was, again, it's individual specific. It's relative to everything that we're doing is relative to the outcomes, and getting clear on what the outcomes are, what the targets are, and then having the plan in place from there, just reverse engineering that. And then you mentioned carb loading then. That's probably one of my most popular questions, is how do I go about a carb load? And even when you build out a document and send it to people, they still want to ask more questions about it. So I thought I'd just get the expert in to give his opinion. So when it comes to, especially this time of year, players are getting back into team training and games are coming up. For carb loading strategies, like what are your go-to recommendations for, firstly, carb loading the day before game day -1, and then maybe game day eating strategies after that?
Cool. So I guess like start with like the outcome we want to achieve. So many players will kind of start a game, they might feel great, might have that spring in their step, but then they'll start to fade towards the end of a match. And most likely that's not going to be because they're not fit enough. Like, they train a lot, they're going to be fit enough to run around for 60 minutes, okay? So if they're starting to feel like this, if they're not able to maintain their performance and they're not able to mentally stay engaged with the game, it might just be a case that they're lacking carbohydrate intake. So lacking carbohydrates, and therefore the carbohydrate intake the day before and the morning of is insufficient. Now, a lot of players may think, right, my pre-match meal, like 3 hours before, I'll just smash in loads of pasta and I'll be fully fueled. Well, that pasta, the carbohydrates in that pasta, probably won't have enough time to digest, absorb, and replenish glycogen stores in that time. like to a significant kind of effect anyway, maybe like 10% if it's a really big carbohydrate meal. But what might happen then is that you may have a lot of food sitting in your gut going into a game, and therefore you feel heavy, feel kind of sluggish. So my KPI is kind of muscles full, belly empty. So the muscles are fully loaded with the carbohydrates, so glycogen, and there's nothing really heavy sitting in your stomach. So you kind of feel like light and tight, you're kind of springy and bouncy, you know. That's the way I like to do it. So what we do then is carbohydrate load the day before. So we're going to consume more carbohydrates than we actually need to replenish our muscle glycogen and our liver glycogen. And therefore, when we have this excess of carbohydrates, we can supercompensate the amount of carbohydrates we store in the muscle. And this is going to be most noticeable during the back end of a game. Like you can get through the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of a game with minimal amount of carbohydrates on board. But it's how you then have that kind of durability and repeatability towards the end of a game. That is going to be determined by how well you carbohydrate load the day before. And when it comes to carbohydrate loading, people will be almost surprised by how much they actually need to have. So this could be anywhere between 6 to 8 grams per kilogram that you weigh. So, you know, some people might be pushing 600 plus grams of carbohydrates the day before, which may be quite kind of alien to them because they may feel like, well, all I'm doing is eating. It doesn't quite feel normal. They might have a little bit of resistance to it. But as soon as they get all those carbohydrates in, their performance the next day will be considerably better. Again, definitely towards the back end of the match. So there's a couple of do's and don'ts when it comes to carbohydrate loading. What we don't want to do is leave your carbohydrate intake too late towards the end of the day. So a carb load is much more than like having spaghetti bolognese the night before and getting a little bit more pasta in there. Like every single meal is big. So if you need 600 grams of carbohydrates, that's like 6 meals and 100 grams of carbs in each. So you start nice and early, breakfast, mid-morning, lunch, mid-afternoon, dinner, maybe a little dessert or something. Everything is going to be really high in carbs, okay? Because what I see a lot is they might have like a normal day of eating. They get to 6 p.m, they have the evening meal, then they look at like the numbers and like, wow, I still got another 250 or 300 grams of carbohydrates to get in. So a couple of issues happen here. One, they don't actually get it all in because they're so full that they just can't eat all that food, and therefore that affects their fueling and performance for the next day. Or they do get everything in, but they're so full and bloated before going to bed that they don't sleep properly, and that affects their performance. And sometimes if you have like an early match the next day, say like lunchtime or beforehand, you're going to wake up, you're going to feel still quite bloated and quite full. You're probably not going to have that much of an appetite, and that's going to affect the amount of carbohydrates and the amount of food you can consume in the meals leading up to a match. So that can affect your fueling. So with carbohydrate loading, start early, start really proactive, and then just keep on top of your carb intake throughout the course of the day. That'd be a really important one. Second one as well is try and keep your fiber intake a little bit lower, because fiber is just going to sit in your stomach, is going to satiate you, so you're going to feel quite full, and that could potentially reduce your drive to consume the adequate amount of carbohydrates you need. And plus, if you've got more food sitting in your stomach, you're just going to feel super bloated, just potentially not that great in yourself. So I typically keep your fiber intake down. I typically keep your dietary fat intake down as well, just so calories just don't go excessive. And this also just helps with food choices as well, because if you then go a little bit low on the dietary fat side, you're going to have, yes, you can have like the spaghetti bolognese or the pasta and stuff like that, but you're not putting a mountain of cheese on it. So it just helps with food choices a bit more as well. And then what I'll typically do is okay the day before, but on a day of is just avoiding kind of red meat, because red meat's quite hard to break down. Some athletes I work with, they don't like having red meat the day before, so if they're having a spaghetti bolognese, instead of having beef mince, they might have like turkey mince or something like that, just because it's a little bit easier to digest, and they wake up the next morning still feeling they're just feeling like quite light and springy instead of like full and bloated and heavy and stuff. So they'd be like the main kind of key points with carbohydrate loading. Like, know how much you need, between 6 to 8 grams per kilo, spread that evenly across the day, and start nice and proactively. And what I'd recommend as well is actually trialing this. Sounds quite ridiculous, like, oh, you need to trial eating carbohydrates, but pick like a performance-based session towards the end of preseason that replicates game day demands. Even if you have like a pre-season friendly or something, and just trial a carbohydrate load just so you're familiar with it, and therefore you know what to expect. Because if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a lot of food for sure.
Yeah, 100%. I've had that experience before myself. I think one of the first times, carb loading and creatine and championship nerves and beetroot juice and everything all mixed together wasn't a pretty stomach. But no, that's perfect, mate. Thanks very much. And you sort of touched on it there. My next thing was going to be around, again, another question is, what's the best foods to eat before a game? What's the best pre-match meal, pre-training meal? Obviously that's going to be individual dependent, but you give like a bit of a breakdown there in terms of keeping fiber low, maybe avoiding the likes of red meat. What would be your recommendations for constructing a meal? Obviously you can't give a perfect meal because everyone's going to be different, but what would your recommendations be to how to construct a pre-match or pre-training meal?
Yeah, it's very much the approach. It's going to depend on what time you like starting, but what I typically like to do, as we've kind of worked through before, is starting with the biggest meal furthest away and then tapering your food into kickoff, into the throw-in. So what we want to do is wake up with your muscle glycogen stores fully loaded, and you can achieve that by putting a carbohydrate load in the previous day. But your other carbohydrate tank, so your liver glycogen, will go down 20-25% overnight. So the carbohydrates at breakfast are going to be, it's quite sufficient amount of them just to replenish that liver glycogen. So then all you have to do between waking up after that breakfast and actually playing is just maintaining carbohydrate intake based on movement and things like this. So all the carb loading is done the day before. You do all the heavy lifting with fueling the day before. All we're doing on match day is just staying on top of everything. So as we worked through before, again, like this law of halves. So looking at maybe 6 hours before, starting with your biggest carbohydrate meal, and then you kind of half the duration, so 3 hours out, then you'd half the amount, and then just really taper it into the start of the match, into like warm up basically. So you're starting like really nice and big and then just tapering in, because if you did it the other way around, you wake up, you don't have much of a breakfast, and then you start fueling up from your pre-match meal 3 hours out, you're just not going to necessarily digest all that food in time, especially if you go quite heavy on it. And not only is that going to not replenish your glycogen stores to a significant amount that we need to see performance improvements towards the back end of the game, it's also just going to be sitting heavy in your gut. And if you think, if you've got loads of carbohydrate in your gut, you've got loads of food in your gut, yes, it's in the body, like you consumed it, but it's not in the right compartment, i.e. the muscles and the liver, to actually support physical and mental performance. So if you go into the next training session or the next kind of match and you're like, oh, I've got a lot of food sitting heavy in my gut, it's like, that's just a timing issue. Yes, it could be a composition issue, like you might have fiber, fat, and like protein and stuff, which delay digestion and absorption, but it is most likely just going to be a timing thing. You just either have to reduce the amount of food consumed in that meal or just push it kind of further back. So the general recommendations, they're quite vague in terms of fueling. It's basically 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per kilo body weight, 1 to 4 hours pre. So if you're going to take this kind of law of halves kind of approach, 4 hours out, you might have, I don't know, your biggest. So basically, if you have 4 hours, you want to try and get around 4 grams per kilogram of carbs in there. Some people I work with, they like having 4 grams per kilo all at breakfast, and then they don't really have anything between that time because it takes so long for that food to be digested. Where some people might go 2 grams per kilo, then 2 grams per kilo, then into the match. Some might do 3 and 1.5 or 1, whatever kind of approach typically works best. But the general kind of principle is start big and then taper in. Don't do it the other way around, because if you do it the other way around, it's not going to be best for fueling, and you're going to feel pretty shit going into that match.
100%. I'd say lots of players been there beforehand. So yeah, definitely that timing thing is a big one. Again, that comes into like that, you mentioned being proactive, actually having a plan in place rather than just winging it on the day and going, right, I have a match here, I need to get all this food into me, and then they stuff themselves and feel like shit getting into the game. So yeah, makes sense, mate. 2 more questions for you. One was around, the first one is around food quality and performance foods. So the Rice Krispie Square Bar, I think you're the man that pioneered the Rice Krispie Square Bar in the GAA circle. So can you explain to people that carb loading is not just eating 10 Rice Krispie Square Bars, or getting to a game and going, right, I've had my square bar before training or a match, that's me good to go. So you talk a bit around high quality foods and then so-called like sort of performance foods. If you could let us in on that for a wee bit.
Yeah, so it's funny with the Rice Krispie Square, it seems to be kind of everywhere now. I don't know if I made it popular or whether just other people had the same kind of conclusion as I did, but I remember when I worked with a rugby league team up in Hull, and we were sponsored by this supplement company, and they're sending in they're like energy bars, and they're like £2.53 a bar. And I was looking at them, I was like, this looks just like a Rice Krispie Square, and it tastes like a Rice Krispie Square. Why don't we just buy Rice Krispie Squares? So it kind of just went from there, and they're more palatable, and it just kind of went from there. So like when it comes to food quality, I think this is one thing that a lot of athletes will just skim over. They kind of grasp the idea of, calories, protein, carbs, all this kind of stuff, but then they'll just kind of forget about food quality. And food quality, especially fruit and veggies, fiber intake, antioxidant intake, makes such a significant difference towards your physical and mental health, your performance, your recovery. So we want to have a good bulk of our food through high quality foods. So this is like minimally processed, naturally occurring. Now we don't have to have 100% of foods from high quality foods, but we want to try and make the bulk of our foods come from like naturally occurring foods, right? Now where the Rice Krispie Squares come into it, I see these as like a supplement. So sometimes when you just have really high carbohydrate intakes, your appetite will only get you through so much of it. And if you still need to hit all these carbs for the day, but you just can't get any more in, this is where these kind of foods can come in, like your squares, your bagels, your jams, and all this kind of stuff. It's just easy to digest, low in fiber, and it just allows you to hit these carb intakes quite nicely. Rice Krispie Squares are going to be great, or like cereal bars in general, really, surrounding games, surrounding training sessions, because if you need that carb top up, you want an easy to digest form of carbohydrates that's gonna sit well in your gut and not cause any kind of gastrointestinal issues whilst kind of playing. Where if you have, say, like, some might say like, oh, why don't you just have a banana instead? Perfect, amazing. But some people may not be able to tolerate a banana closer to those kind of sessions as a top up. Like if you think of a square, it's maybe 28 grams in weight, is going to give you 20ish grams of carbohydrate, where a banana is like 100 grams in weight and give you the same amount of carbohydrates. So some people just can't tolerate the food volume and the food weight in the gut before going into a harder kind of training session. So this is where these kind of sports kind of foods or supplements, like to call them, can be beneficial. I'm never going to sort of program for someone, say like, right, mid-afternoon snack, let's take out the fruits, let's put in some squares bars. That's not going to be the case. It's going to be a time and a place for them. And if you see these foods as a supplement to supplement the diet to hit higher carb intakes, especially surrounding training sessions that could be of higher intensity, that's where they're going to be beneficial. The same thing with cereals, your Cocoa Pops and things like this. This is where it's going to be beneficial. When you have to hit those higher carb intakes and you have them reasonably close to a training session or a match, this is where they're going to be beneficial. So if you had like, an evening training session and you usually have like oats for breakfast, that would be a good option for breakfast, right? You wouldn't then potentially put the Cocoa Pops in for breakfast in that point, because you've got like 10 hours to digest that food before you get into the session at night. But if you needed that carb top up beforehand, then yes, that's where cereals and stuff can be beneficial for sure.
And final question is around nutrition for injured athletes. So obviously this has been our main focus in this sort of phase of working together, and I am well aware that you just recorded a class episode with Alan Murdoch. Actually listened to that today, so we'll direct players to that to get more in depth from it, to get more detail from it, and I suppose what you may be going to explain here in more detail. But I suppose if you could give us 3 sort of mistakes or bits of advice, to just 3 points around nutrition for injured athletes and how they maybe shoot themselves in the foot, hold back their progress, or what they can do to fast track their progress from injury. Just 3 quick ones off the top of your head, and then we can I'll drop the link in the description to the full episode so where they can catch up on the real detail in there.
Key kind of mistakes I see people do. So it doesn't really matter what kind of injury it is, whether it is bone, muscle, connective tissue. What I see a lot of people do, as I covered in the podcast with Al, is that they'll drop into a calorie deficit, or they just won't eat enough, and therefore that is going to delay any form of healing taking place. And if you got the limb like immobilized, that's going to accelerate muscle mass loss. So first thing people do wrong is just not feed the healing process, and they don't give enough kind of respect to this. Like, I appreciate that if it's definitely a long termer, they might be like maybe have like a little bit of a target of, right, I'm going to drop body fat during this period so I could come back playing in the best shape possible. I love that, but there's a time and a place to do it. So if you try dropping calories when you need to be feeding the body to support this energetic cost of like healing, then you're just going to shoot yourself in the foot. Like you said, it's going to slow down. And as we discussed the other day, I can't say by how much it's going to delay it, whether it's days, weeks, months, I don't know. But like mechanistically, you can see that if you start restricting calories, you're going to delay healing, and you're going to promote muscle mass loss, especially if the limb is like immobilized, if it's in a cast or something. So that'd be the first mistake I see people do. Second one is not consume enough protein, because protein intake drives muscle protein synthesis, and this is the process of not only kind of maintaining but building new muscle mass tissue. So if you haven't got enough protein on board and you're trying to rebuild like an injured like tendon or ligament or something like that, you're just going to be slowing and delaying the process. And plus, if you don't have enough protein on board, that limb that might be immobilized, you're potentially going to lose muscle mass much quicker there as well. And the key part of like a successful rehab program is getting back strength, getting back muscle mass in that injured area. And you know, if you're not eating enough calories throughout the course of the day, if you're not eating enough protein, you're basically just going to kind of take yourself further away from that objective. So they're going to be the two main things. And then the third one is going back to food quality. Like, we know that any nutrient deficit is going to interfere with kind of healing. Okay, so just making sure that food quality is high. Like, I think it's quite trendy when people start looking at like a turmeric or something like that. You know, there may be some tiny benefit, but the effect size is so small compared to like sort of energy intake and protein intake. But food quality as a whole is going to be really important to minimize nutrient deficiencies and basically just give the body what it needs to support healing and recovery. So they'd be the main things. And it's the world-class basics. It's like these principles can be applied to pretty much everything kind of performance related. It's meet the body's demands, make sure your energy intake is aligned with the expenditure of what you need, make sure you eat enough protein, and make sure you're mostly eating high quality foods. They'd be the main three. And then if there's add a bonus one, you can't forget sleep. Like, sleep is the most potent regenerative tool we have available. So they'd be like 3 plus a bonus.
Love it, mate. Unbelievable. Thanks very much. And with that, like, there's so much value in that, and I'm sure players will take so much from it as well. Personally, I did, just to sort of top up a few things and give me a new lens and answering questions for some of the questions that I'm getting in. So appreciate that, mate. And I suppose I'll drop your details and stuff, your Instagram profile in the description, but where can people find you? Where can people find out more about you?
Instagram is probably the place to be. I appreciate there's quite a lot of platforms around at the moment, but Instagram is the one I'm most active on. So just search Chris Lowe Nutrition or the Athlete Nutrition Coach, and you shall find me there. And if there's any questions about anything we covered today, just drop me a DM and I'll happily get back to you. And then on that kind of Instagram profile, got links to my website and all that kind of good stuff.
Lovely stuff, mate. Thanks very much. And yeah, there is serious amount of information. Even if there's anything that I want to find out again about nutrition, I just go on the Chris's profile and scroll down it, and he'll have some sort of post on it. So I'm guaranteed you'll find plenty of value in there. Chris, thanks very much for coming on, mate. Appreciate it. That was top class. And yeah, again, thanks very much, and best of luck.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Chat soon. So that was a great chat we had with Chris Lowe there, the nutritionist. The man is an absolute genius when it comes to nutrition, sports nutrition, and everything around improving your performance on the pitch. So if you enjoyed it, make sure you give us a subscribe, you give it a like, and you share it with a teammate who has the dad of a child. Other than that, catch you in the next video, and thanks very much for watching.